And they closed the curtain.
For school.
And then when they were going to turn the projector on, they closed the curtain.
Story of film. I got more homework to do than they do.
You guys ready? Yeah. Ready to go?
As you see fit.
Well, I mean,
At your leisure.
it's a little early. It's 6:14.
Oh, wait, well.
We could wait.
At your leisure, my liege.
All right, I guess we will go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to the latest installment of Fountain Street Church's Screen Club. Today's sponsors are the wonderful Thriller Chiller Film Fest directors.
Hello. Thank you.
All right, so we're talking about Stranger Things today. Hopefully you already know that. Let's go through some more formal introductions. I'm Sarah Vesely. I'm the director of Wealthy Theater. I also teach film, just like Tony does here too. And we have Shirley and Tony Griffin. You guys want to say a little bit about yourselves?
Well, I'm Shirley, and you're Shirley. Don't call me Shirley.
I'm looking at my president and festival director of Thriller Chiller, Shirley Griffin. I also founded a business where I teach actors how to brand themselves called Act Like a Brand. We just finished our festival last week,
Yes.
Thriller Chiller, right here at Wealthy Theater,
Mm-hmm.
and that's an action, sci-fi, suspense, horror film festival, mostly with independent movies, and then we played 5 cult classics this year too. So
Yeah.
super
Fantastic.
fun event. If you're interested, check us out at thrillerchiller.com, and we'll probably be doing some more events throughout the year, more than just our annual festival we're working on. We have some ideas to partner with people anyway, so we'll see what happens. But anyway, every October we're here at the Wealthy Theater.
For now. No.
And if you like Stranger Things, like seriously, their film fest, a genre film fest, that might be kind of a vague term for some people, but it's like action, sci-fi, horror, like all the cool stuff about Stranger Things is what you see in their film fest. So seriously, don't miss it next year. Maybe you'll get lucky and maybe they'll do some kind of throwback, like in case you missed it or something with this year's films, but we'll see what happens.
It's interesting how it thematically ties into the conversation that we're going to have about nostalgia.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, this is one of like 2 white slides. I tried to go black so it doesn't find you. But as mentioned, Thriller Chiller is one of the sponsors today, as well as the Community Media Center, which is what I represent. That includes Wealthy Theater. And Shirley is actually on the board of the CMC.
We love the CMC.
Yes.
We're all about media literacy, so that's why we're partnering with Fountain Street Church for this excellent series. I lied. There are 3 white slides.
Yeah.
So just a heads up, there will be spoilers. So if you're not caught up on Stranger Things, you might want to plug your ears here and there. We'll try to stay away from like really, really big stuff, but I know
They all die.
Dumbledore dies. But just a heads up that's the point of the Screen Club, is that the idea is you've already watched it, you come here and we overanalyze it. We have kind of a book club style discussion about it, so there might be spoilers and you can blame it all on Tony.
Gladly.
Yep.
I'll take the heat.
Yep.
I can carry
His
that
lawyer
weight.
is standing by, so don't worry.
What?
All right, so let's dive into it. I think the biggest thing about this show, probably the first thing that draws people in, is the 80s nostalgia. So do you guys want to jump into it, of your thoughts on what it does well, what it doesn't do well?
I'll just say that as growing up as a kid in the 80s, this is the first show I've ever seen that actually feels like the 80s for real. Most of the time when I see someone having nostalgia for the 80s in a film or a TV show, I'm rolling my eyes about, come on, that's not how it was.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, like any epoch, it becomes hyper romanticized. Usually in film, they'll do something, they'll go, hey, remember his only jackets didn't come in that color, or that sense of neon wasn't really used until 88 instead of 84. And I mean, it's easy to parse those little bits down, but this really is the first show that sort of takes its cues really well and then knows when to sort of throttle down and pull back on when to use it. And of course, their touchstones are all used right here. And Stand By Me and Goonies, and I can't tell what that is down there. That's
Neverending Story.
There we go. I knew you would get
thank you. Yep. And then this one I think is Ghoulies. right here, right?
That's E.T.
Oh, that's E.T. Oh.
But yeah, I'm looking at these thinking the thematics are, I think a lot of people try to like make the Goonies again or make that type of story where the kids have an adventure and it doesn't always work, but you have a sense of loss, of like fear of growing up, and they find the dead body and, you know, oh, he doesn't have a dad, but he finds a best friend and an alien. And
Yeah, the ideas of
these kids, you know,
a stigma
these
from broke.
kids,
Yeah.
the kids who find something that the adults don't believe, and they, all of those have that. The kids are in search of, like, going on an adventure, but doing a detective,
Yeah.
what's the word? Investigation
Yeah, investigatory.
of something that the adults don't even believe is real, so.
Something also key to the 80s was the idea about broken homes and families and how that would change the dynamic of how people were behaving. The idea of latchkey kids, something that later in the 90s in Fight Club, they actually comment about that with we're the lost generation, where we're the ones who were sort of like, we all be rock stars and music gods, but this all was BS. That sort of idea, that existential dread, is rooted in the idea that there's a loss of some sort of parental guidance or overlook in the 80s.
Does everyone familiar with the phrase latchkey kids? Do you know what that means? Okay.
I presume you'd scream out if you're like going,
Well,
what?
I didn't know if that was like just a thing from our time. I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's almost got a Peanuts type of thing here where the parents, in a lot of cases, aren't really present. But when they are present, there's a very important function that they serve to the narrative, which I'm sure we will cover.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, too, we touched on how adventure is kind of a common theme throughout the 80s films, and when you're doing kind of a nod to the 80s, too. And we'll get into specifically living vicariously through these stories. But, yeah, I just think that it's really interesting that we're leaning into that. And for the 80s, it kind of made sense that this is the path of storytelling that we want to go down, of like the latchkey kid, the lack of parental guidance, because we're, you know, not too far out of the baby boomers era when the American dream is kind of the big thing. So you would think that this is sort of living in that American dream world, but now we're kind of past that. We've had like the Vietnam War and things like that.
Sure.
That are really rattling America, and I'm just focusing on American TV and cinema. So it's neat how that had a ripple effect in 80s TV, and so we'll kind of dive into that of like, why is there a resurgence of this with Stranger Things and other shows, and why is that theme popular?
You know what
Yes,
this
yeah.
show, you know what Stranger Things does really well compared to the 80s too, is there's a sense in these films that these friendships you make when you're this age are like the best friendships you have in your life, and they last your whole life. And even if you grow apart, you're like, you always remember those people. They were just so important to your to yourself, how you became,
Yeah.
who you became. as
And
you were
your
growing up.
adult development is really, the formative years are between the ages of 12 and 20. Your taste and style and affectation about your belief in society and its structure is really formed through those cognitive things that happen with culture and society at that time. It has a great weight and bearing compared to other parts of your life.
So along the lines of this adventure theme that we have going on with the 80s films and TV shows, as well as Stranger Things, I mean, the essence of it starts with this concept of them playing D&D and these parallels to D&D and storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any D&D players in the house? What up? Let's start something
40
here.
years ago, you wouldn't admit that.
Yeah.
Right? So in the 80s, that was sort of the nerd territory supreme.
Yeah.
And the behaviors that they have about formulating their own narratives about being the heroes, and then even the names of the characters and things that they confront in a reality versus a fantasy, the Demogorgon,
Right.
and their interactions with each other are really based on the idea that they control their own narratives.
Yep. I think it's fascinating that you have with this show kind of like an inception of storytelling, that they're telling you a story of Stranger Things, and then within that you have like kind of a D&D storytelling and role playing, so a story and a story and a story, and then you got the upside down, so
Yes.
it's all over the place. But I feel like they tried to base the show off of the concept of playing D&D, and then it feels like it just went way far away from that. And I was a little disappointed that it didn't get a little more on the nose with playing it. I think you see the most of it in season 1, and 2 and 3 just kind of trail off aside from a couple nods to it with characters or words.
Yeah, I never played, so I can't speak to that thematic other than I think they used it as like a way to like something to kick aside as they grow into adulthood, like, oh, we're not children anymore, we don't do that, even though they kind of wanted to.
Yeah, it's interesting how, you know, it starts, the story picks up in 83, right? Is that the idea? It was 82 or 83? And right now the latest season's in 1985. And, you know, initially going back over the season in preparation for this, there was a lot of things as far as how it starts and where it's gone so far. I'm like, why does it feel like there's a decline or a change in what's going on? Why do they have to keep going back to the same methods? And my hope initially was this to be more like a Monster Squad type of thing, where they were taking on some new creature or some new situation, a serial type situation, as opposed to episodic. And instead, we're here in the 3rd season still coping with things from the upside down. So in sort of deconstructing it and pulling it apart, the major point was it all pivots around D&D and the idea that you are the boss of your own story.
I think another reason why this was kind of a popular thing to lean into is that a lot of screenwriters, as well as, you know, if you're writing novels or anything like that, they're starting to get into D&D to learn storytelling and creating this world, which that's how I got into it. I never played it growing up, but I recently played it. I'm like, oh my gosh, where has this been all my life?
Super fun.
Oh, it's so cool. Yeah. So, right, guys? Super cool. Oh, yeah. So I think, if anything, maybe they played it growing up, they're inspired by it, it makes for kind of a cool storyline, and it's these never-ending possibilities, too, that it's not just one story, it's a choose-your-own adventure, but I think it's having another ripple effect that other storytellers and creatives, and I mean, I've heard that people use it even for learning improv, that not as the dungeon master, but as everyone else playing, you've got to kind of think on the fly, roll the dice, take a stab at it. So it's neat.
Well,
that
yeah,
it's
and that call to
there.
adventure is real easy to do there when you have them kind of parallel something that happens. It's also a really great way to delineate class structure and social structures about who can use certain things and don't need to. You know, the rich kids with their fancy cars and boats, and the kids who are middle income are like, hey, we have this. This is our thing. And back in the 80s, certainly when that D&D was developed and started becoming a thing, there was the whole idea that somehow that was a gateway portal to Satanism and evil and stuff like that. And even I think Tom Hanks' first made-for-TV movie, Mazes and Monsters, plays on the idea that he becomes so obsessed with D&D that he can't distinguish reality from his fantasy. And he has to go into, I think it ends with him going into a mental institution to correct his feelings. So it's a fascinating use of the time and era in which it is compared to, say, now.
Would have been neat if that was kind of the scenario for these guys, that they wrote themselves into the upside down and then can't separate reality from fiction.
Exactly.
Well, there's a season 4 coming.
Yeah,
so.
hey,
Yeah,
and
I'll
the
call
staff
Duffer
writer
Brothers.
job's up, so
Yeah, sweet.
let's work it.
All right. So going along the lines of that storytelling adventure, we talk about living vicariously. So do you guys want to take a stab at that, kind of explaining why we feel like that's something that also draws the audience in with this kind of show and or just adventure and fantasy in general?
I kind of skipped ahead by touching on the social structures and how that all works together. So imagine that slide popped up while she was doing that. But that's the long and the short of it, again, is the idea that we as storytellers and authors of our own life can manifest a destiny based on what we see ourselves becoming, and also, you know, good and evil are very well distinguished in that fantasy. as opposed to say structurally in real life that's not as easy to distinguish, or in the reality of the universe that this takes place in, which looks very much like our own.
Shirley, do you want to jump in on it?
I don't really have anything with that. I mean, it makes me feel nostalgia for the 80s because I grew up then, but I don't feel vicariously
Not so much.
through these characters. So.
It's interesting because I think like with, you know, Goonies and E.T. and those different adventure movies, growing up watching those, it's a little different because then you're closer in age to the characters. Just like, I mean, Harry Potter, reading that at the age that the characters were throughout the books, I feel like I can live vicariously, and I swear to God, one of these days I'll get my letter from Hogwarts, but we'll see what happens with that.
Hufflepuff.
Yeah. Slytherin. Oh,
Slytherin, I
come
can
on,
see that
Slytherin.
for sure. I'm definitely Hufflepuff.
So I wonder if it's just kind of a difference with age because it's a younger group, and maybe for a younger audience they can live a little more vicariously, but still you have the adventure, the nostalgia, you've got kind of a role-playing thing going on. I don't know, navigating through this other world and trying to figure out the mystery. What all did you guys think? I'm going to start pulling you, the audience, into the discussion. Do we feel like we live vicariously, or it's different when you're younger? Yeah, what do you think?
I definitely did. I mean, I was a young child in the 80s. I was born in 83. But a lot of this, it still spoke to me. A lot of it I, remembered some later on, in the 80s. And part of it, I think, spoke to me because it's like, I didn't get to be myself in the 80s either. I didn't get to be who I wanted to be in the 80s, so that it kind of, I wanted to be right there with them, or I felt like I could be there with them. So it was exciting.
Yeah.
In that part. Very.
Good. I like the input. Any other thoughts on that? Living vicariously, or even any of the other stuff we've kind of talked about so far? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not really sure exactly where this fits in or how to plug it in, but I've just been thinking about, like, in the third season where they have this very real-world enemy of the Russians. I don't know if you guys were going to get to that later, but okay.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm just thinking about how that plugs into the fantasy versus reality, and we get different glimpses of different worlds there.
Yeah, we kind of get into more like the cultural, social aspect of things.
It's interesting they use that. Of all the songs that were really popular in like 84, 85, they used the Never Ending Story as a song, because that is probably the world's worst. Second worst song. So it's, I know, but it's still, it really does set your teeth to like, because it's like so sugary and so interesting that, I mean, really, you have to stand back and go, why that song? It's this earworm that once it gets in there, I mean, I can hear it now, and it's, I'm sure we'll cover that when we get to it, but it's just like, why that song, and why did they spend the time to really develop this character that you don't see, to essentially end up being the foil for this character in this situation. It was like, well, I won't help you unless you sing Never Ending Story with me, and you're going, this entire season's gonna crash, everyone's life, the stakes are so high that it's all based on him singing Never Ending Story with her, so that she feels accepted as part of his life at that moment. It was like, oh my gosh. It just amped up. So the tension with that song was just like, you just want to throw the remote across the room.
They should have just cut to black and been like, all right, roll credits,
we're done. That's it. Yeah, season done. Why not go for the real French New Wave ending? I like it.
Right.
Remember this part, is that Dustin's girlfriend?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, you don't know exists until like that very moment when you finally get her. Just like, oh, she really is a real person.
Yeah. Well, since we had kind of the point brought up about...
yes, thank you.
Yeah, did you look at the slideshow?
Yeah, well, hacking our stuff. I love it.
Yeah, so Tony, do you want to take the lead on this? I know you got some good thoughts on it.
Yeah, it was, so going, again, standing back and looking at it and comparing it to like right now, the late 20-teens. And you have the yuppies of the 80s where there was a preponderance of importance about having money and status and importance and building that. You were only as important as your paycheck and what you could represent, like a Wall Street type of thing. Versus now where, say, a millennial mindset is sort of predisposed towards green or a push away from I am not my paycheck. Certainly, if you were to believe the way things are put out now, millennials are the destruction of anything that's cool or neat about franchises has been destroyed by the millennial influence of not wanting to participate and being a part of the social contract of what's happening. So it's interesting that to take a time and place and compare it to now, they're very distinctly different on opposite sides. It's the same thing with business and the franchises versus mom and pop. Certainly in the show, I mean, I certainly don't recall it, but they make a big point of showing how the store that Winona Ryder's working in, you realize that all the displays and the things that were about the mom and pop stores in the town are being deconstructed and broken down, and they're all at the Starcourt Mall now. And I didn't even kind of pick up on that until later in the season. You
I
go,
don't think it happened that fast. That seemed kind of unrealistic to me. The mall was the place. It was a big deal, but I don't recall that small businesses went out. It's not like it wasn't.
And
like,
they were out picketing in the show, going, "You're killing our business." I'm like, I don't recall it happening that fast.
I mean,
and
eventually
in that
Home
way.
Depot replaced like the Ace Hardwares and mom and pop type.
But you're saying throughout the 80s, you start to have these structures being built, like the malls and whatnot, but it didn't really kick off until you hit like 90s.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
Sure.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I want to mention about the yuppies. That phrase was so negative in the 80s. It was so like.
It was an insult, the way it's millennials is used now.
It was considered like
well.
You're an elitist who only cares about money. You know, like.
Yeah.
Anyway, knowing that, a friend of mine called me a yuppie about 10 years ago, and I was like, what? What are you doing? And then he just looked at me like, come on. I mean, because it means young urban professional. So in that sense, I'm like, well, I guess you're right. But in the 80s sense of like, oh, you're
I'm a Gen Xer. Take that.
Exactly.
That's so much cooler sounding. Yeah.
So, yeah, we can say that was a thing, but it was also a very negative thing.
Well, like Tony was saying, the phrase millennial or that term is to a lot of people offensive, even though it's just saying like, no, you were born in this window of time. That is what you are.
Yeah, it's loaded with venom when it's usually brought out and discussed. Rarely is it like, oh, millennial, I can't. It's usually like, oh, millennial, this is their fault. The society is coming apart. It's like, no, it happens with every generation. That same leverage has been used on it. It's just really interesting to use it in this as an 80s trope to parallel the difference between the 80s and their behaviors
people tend to
versus
focus
now.
on the largest population that's coming up that has the money, and then they market to those people, and it was the Gen X and the millennials and whatever the next generation is. It's like the young people who they think have the spending power, so suddenly they're like the people who are marketed to and get blamed for everything, and because things change, it's your fault, and it's just
Yeah, and it kind of
society,
segues into global warming versus the ozone hole. We're all like, if the ozone hole goes away, the world will be destroyed, and then of course now the ozone hole is like, oh, it's kind of plugged up. We did something
and
about
there were
it.
ridiculous things that they told us in the news, like, oh, if you better stop using aerosol sprays for like hairspray because you're gonna make a hole. And I'm picturing like I'm like 15 years old using hairspray, picturing like I'm spraying a little and it's making this big hole, and
I've seen
that
the
kind of
pictures
visual.
with the hair, the mall hair. You were
the same thing with the Russian.
it.
I mean, that was as unrealistic as that would have happened. It was really scary.
Yeah.
And you can really compare that to now with what kids are going through.
Yeah, whereas like a threat of nuclear annihilation was a singular spot.
There was
the
few
enemy,
movies like War Games where a kid's playing video games and he's suddenly like
Miracle Mile.
playing nuclear war games with a computer, or like Red Dawn where the Russians invade this town and the kids are...
Yeah, that's right. Red Dawn with the Russians invading small town America.
The kids start an army.
So whereas there was a label for a singular threat in the 80s, now the threat is nebulous. It can come from anywhere at any time for any ideological reason that sees America as the bedrock of the destruction of the social fabric.
I think we still do have like very specific fear mongering, whether we're talking about the climate, climate change, or Russia. I think there is kind of directed fear mongering with that, and as far as the 80s and the threat of nuclear disaster. I mean, we had Chernobyl, so of course that's going to build to that fear, but a specific attack on us, I mean, yes, that's a little
Sure,
bit different.
and Chernobyl in '86, but even then we didn't find out the repercussions of how awful that was until,
Yeah,
you know,
it was all
Right.
covered up.
15 years later when you're like, wow,
But it was
that
constant,
was
like,
awful.
you know, bravado, Ronald Reagan, blah, 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 and you know, red telephone, and, you know, it's just all this stuff about, to make us afraid all the time, like it was all boisterous. That's how I saw it in 6th grade anyway, and like, it was
Well,
just about
and the
how I
music
was. And it
of the
really
time.
relates, it just go back to, obviously, Stranger Things, you know, you can see how them bringing up those things from the 80s can really be relatable today to what people are going through. It's the whole
Sure.
point of this, I think.
Well, the point that, and to add to that, is that everything, certainly in the '80s, there's a simplification that comes from being able to label it as a singular mode of danger as opposed to coming from everywhere. So like the upside down, the threat can come from anywhere. But the exterior label for the us as people against each other, man versus man, if you will, if this is the trope, then it's Americans versus Russians. You can clearly see them, the way they dress, the way they operate, the way they talk. Almost so much so they're almost hyper stylized beyond what they were used in the 80s as a villain to more what they would look like probably now, where guys are dressed in black with shaved heads and goatees. I'm like, that's not a look that was prevalent in the 80s. That's something more used now in the late aughts and 2010s. That's a visual style cue that just comes from them wanting to perpetuate what a villain would look like, yet they want to maintain this Anglo look to it as opposed to any other type of look. Because in the 80s they would use Asians or Hispanics to do that, and nowadays that you can't do that. That ends up being marginalizing and diminishing for cultures as well. So they really are very careful about how they're structuring their story elements visually with a thought about what is happening now compared to how they were portrayed in the 80s, at least as far as cultural and movies were concerned.
It's interesting then that through Stranger Things, we're coming at some of these issues not historically appropriate for like the proper 80s, but
Yeah.
through the lens of where we are now, you know, the 2010s and such. I want to come back to that, but I want to throw it out. Did you want to add anything to your thoughts?
The first 2 seasons, it wasn't Russia, it was a secret government agency that was the villain. And that, to me, is a real 80s thing. It was post-Vietnam. It was paranoia about the government and don't trust authority. It feels that whole thing about this big building there and what's going on in that felt very 80s.
It definitely, in season 3, it does this left turn to very specifics, to definitions of things that you go, there's something kind of turning here versus the first 2 seasons.
Well, I could relate that back to Russia as well because of the way things were then. People really could not leave the country. They had to defect. They had to like find a way to sneak out. Like, you know, I don't know if you're a Red Wings fan, but that's how the Red Wings got Sergei Fedorov, is he had to run away and someone had to help him, right? And it's just, I don't know if people really even think about that or realize that now. It's more of an, I mean, it's not, the USSR isn't a thing, obviously, anymore, but people can come and go, at least, from their country in ways that they couldn't then.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the fall of the wall.
So that relates to the whole, like, government, like, control thing you were talking about.
And we had I think you were mentioning something about your thoughts and theory.
With Russia?
Yeah.
Well, I just think it casts a new light on the way they can tell the story vis-a-vis the ownership of the kids to their own destiny. Because earlier it's this very non-point, undefined government agency, and they're fighting monsters, and then in the 3rd season they're fighting like an actual foe, and it just sort of cast the whole thing in a new light.
Yeah,
It's
good
still fun
observation.
because they're still, you know, it's cool to see kids like beat up adults and do all that stuff. But yeah.
Or watch Steve take a couple of real ground pounders to the body, and you're going,
Right.
man, he should be shitting blood for a week, that kind of thing. And he's just like, oh, wow, this was a rough night.
So it'll be interesting to see if they continue that or if they do another pivot in the 4th season.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, a couple things. So, I do think that some of it is kind of like a genre study when I think about Stranger Things. And I'm kind of interested in why they don't use a lot of the linguistics that you get from that time, pound them into the ground or the I'm gonna bury you and things like that.
Yeah.
You don't hear that coming out as much, It seems like it is kind of more of a genre study, but what genre that is trying to focus in on is kind of confusing, like you said, adventure and fantasy, and there are some others that are kind of emerging out of sci-fi and fantasy, like cosmic horror and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is this more trying to fit that description of cosmic horror that you're seeing,
Interesting you should mention as we move further and deeper into the Upside
I
Down.
think the best genre cinema and TV is the stuff that mixes genres, like for example, Alien, which is a sci-fi and action and a horror movie, that kind of thing. That kind of does this. I don't think it needs to choose. You have more to.
Yeah, just the one other thing I was going to add was, the money thing in terms of like social economic status seems kind of prevalent during that time, especially when you look at like the Goonies, how the big strife in that movie was the not being able to afford the house, and
Sure.
trying to discover the riches to, pay off at the house, and it was this adventure, and really at the end of it, I think Sean, Sean's character that he's playing is, is that, he really wanted that final adventure, even if, nothing was solved in their Hardy Boys adventure, that, that at least they got that final adventure, because in a way, and like going back to being like vicarious about things, he always wanted that adventure, one way or another. So this was his way of, segueing into it.
Yeah, it's the last time they're all together. Very similar to the end of season 3 here, where they're all, for some reason, tragically being pulled apart. You're like, why do they have to move? What's going on? Why? It just was this thing. It was like, why are they touching on that? What's the usage of that in the story? Along the lines of why is there also this cosmic entity still prevalent in the story as well? Why are they continuing down this path? Which leads us to.
Are you talking the Upside Down?
Well, no. Next slide.
That one?
Yes! Oh, the feminist lens! This is definitely into Sarah's territory. I know where this slide came from.
It's the F word. Well, we got to talk feminist, of course.
It's important.
So I'll just start by saying the reason that I wanted to bring up this talking point is primarily because of season 3. I felt like it was just unbelievably frustrating. I feel like they took so many steps backwards. I know that this show is not one that's, super feminist forward. Like Eleven's character is really neat, but I felt like we were starting to take some of those steps. And yes, it's a group of young boys that are kind of leading the adventure, but I'm like, all right, cool, let's be progressive, let's see what happens. I know it's in the 80s, but come on. And then season 3 happened. I'm like, why? Yeah. So we'll get into that. Yeah. But
definitely, there's that sense of confusion comes from like these first 2 seasons set a tone that you have an expectation, and the third one, admittedly, after I finished watching, I was going, well, geez, that kind of jumped the shark somewhere.
Yeah.
And now in reprocessing it for this specific talk, I'm like, okay, I think I can see a pathway to why they're setting up or have set up these characters in this way. And probably the most prevalent use of one of these characters is the one of Nancy.
Yeah, so kind of working backwards with her character and looking at it through a feminist lens. Again, season 3, I think the worst of it really, she's trying to step forward, be a little more progressive. She's trying to do get into what she really likes, her style of research and reporting and that sort of thing. And then, of course, she's marginalized in her role as a reporter, and it is of the time that she would be treated as such. but it's frustrating that we had to go that route, that she had to, you know, work as a professional,
Yeah.
well, not as a journalist, but in that industry, and get shot down. And I was kind of hoping that it would have just been like, you know what, I'm going to go on my own. I'll be like, what do you call it, a stringer? You know,
Yeah.
going out and getting those stories and just showing her value. And it was just so
Well,
frustrating.
she even
that
ends
we
up
had to hit
getting,
these
you know,
walls.
the stereotypical chased down by the men who tormented her professionally. All of a sudden they become upside down beasts, and they're chasing her physically through the hospital and trying to kill her, and she's hiding and running away and needs her boyfriend to show up to kind of help parry that.
Right.
And yet she's also the one, by the time they get to the last episode, she's the one that manages the shotgun, the quintessential phallus of the 80s, which, you know, in the 80s there's always the magic shotgun. When she used it, it blew everything apart, and cars would explode on impact, you know, stuff like that. So
Wait, they don't?
it's a real fascinating, what's that?
They don't explode on impact?
No, they
with shotgun?
really don't. Only in the movies
Shoot.
and in Stranger Things. But it's fascinating to watch her character arc in all the seasons, and, you know, working backwards. I had to stop a second and really go back and go, what did she serve in the story other than she was going to find justice for Barb, and then suddenly it was about, it was just a plot point for her to move through the rest of the story, and then she gets marginalized by the end of the season again. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, there's a funeral for her. I think she's dead. Okay, moving on. And you're like, no, Barb deserved better than that.
Yeah,
So-
she did.
And then definitely by season 1, she's the classic girlfriend or woman in peril situation where the guys are fighting over her, and then they have to save her. So you start looking at, why is she the damsel in distress to the dragons in this story? Why are they using her character, particularly her age, young adult woman and a teenager growing into a woman? Why? One would think that the writers or the perception of the filmmakers is writing that story from right now, looking back, how can they serve the story in the context of the time in which it was made, and yet enable the character to demonstrate, at least if anything, some individuality. And instead, they're threading this needle of her basically being his girl Friday, and this, just these story parallels that are like, it's really not enabling to a degree. Why are they taking this particular character and doing that? Whereas some of the other women they've done in the show lean back the other way. They're stronger. 11, for an example.
I would disagree that she's not strong, because she's a tough cookie. She keeps going. And growing up in
Right.
that time, I can say that's how it was. I don't know, it's not right probably to continue that,
Sure.
that,
Well,
that
certainly,
behavior, but
right.
it's-
Don't misconstrue what I'm saying. I'm simply trying to point out what's the filmmaker's intent. And since the filmmakers aren't here to answer for themselves or do that, you still have to take an objective stance to say, why are they using these tropes in this way? What's the idea of doing that? Because the only way she stands out is a relief to the behaviors of the other people's performances and what they're doing. Which is why when she's the one that grabs the shotgun in the finale episode, you're like, holy shit, where did that come from? It's almost like, why now and why in this place? And I'm sure we will cover that later on.
Right, I'm not disagreeing with you, I just wanted to talk
You
about
are! Wake up!
what it was like to be a young girl growing up in that time, and a lot of it, I think, is just how you think,
Yeah.
based on society, and how, you know, she's constantly told no, and sometimes she believes it and sometimes she doesn't. So I think she's kind of a mirror to Winona Ryder's character in some ways, and that they're both just like, I'm not giving up, I'm gonna keep going after what I want. They keep getting pushed down, obviously, by the men in this world, but wasn't she the one in season 2 who was pursuing? Didn't she go into the Upside Down? Wasn't it her?
Yeah, it is her.
So she
I mean,
is
it's not a
investigating and found it?
one-to-one. She's not reactive the entire time, but when they choose to make her the proactive element, it's usually subservient to the entire plot thread, as opposed to her pushing the elements forward. She becomes
No,
a
I
piece of the
agree.
element that gets pushed aside, and you go, why now? Why is it important to demonstrate her moving the needle this way, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, we're done with Nancy. It almost seems like she gets discarded
I
in the most
agree. I'm just
unceremonious
talking about,
ways.
I tend to talk a lot about how I emotionally am affected by a story and whether I felt like it was real. And that's what I'm responding to. That's what it
Yeah.
was like to be a young girl in the 80s
Yeah.
in a lot of ways.
And by season 3, for me personally, I just got tired of seeing it happen to her. Of all the characters, that one was like really frustrating by that point. Like
Well-
every season, they're gonna make her be the same way. Why is she the most important element that they gotta bounce like a ping pong between these two poles?
And if we're leaning into the point that you're bringing up, Shirley, of it being, I guess, historically accurate, that this is kind of what it would have been like for a girl or a young woman growing up in the 80s, then we got to look at the rest of the show, which is showing the 80s through, again, like current era lens.
Yeah.
That were not accurate. Nate, you brought up the lingo, the linguistics of it, that it's not historically accurate. It's, again, leaning on more modern linguistics. And all the other points that we're touching on are like, well, it's not totally 80s. It's like
Thank you.
doing it now about the 80s. You know, we're very, very much in today. So then if that's the route we're going, it's like, why are we leaning into that 80s trope? Why aren't we taking that too through a modern day lens? I guess that's kind of why I was
Yeah.
frustrated. And I think it's like you guys are kind of on the two sides
Yes,
of it.
trying to
And
do
we're all
both.
like making a triangle of this frustration.
Triangle of frustration!
Yes.
I love it.
What all do you think about Nancy's character, or you know, her character as a device, a plot device, or anything? Her progression through the seasons.
I mean, she did definitely have. I mean, I agree with you a lot on how they treated her, but she did also have some great shining moments where it's like, yes, Nancy, yes, like you know, hit that thing with a baseball bat.
Right,
Or, you know,
yeah.
it's like where she showed girl power kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like, and I did love that, but yeah, I definitely can see what you're saying too.
Yeah, they just have a really peculiar way of, like suddenly, like somebody at the writer's room went, hey, we'll have Nancy do this to demonstrate girl power. But I'm like,
Yeah.
geez, you know, why not write her with that so the actor has some consistency?
Yeah.
Right.
It feels like, I mean, the way she's having to portray this character, it's such a dynamic move between one end to the other. That's got to be incredibly difficult as an actor to pull off that character arc. So why her and why now is really what comes to my mind.
And why keep restarting it?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. It's almost like nobody learned the lesson from before, and it's very relevant and specific to her, in my opinion. It seems that way.
Yeah, I think your note about the writer's room, I feel like that's kind of what I'm getting at. I think that in the writer's room it was probably, oh, we got a lot of guys in here. Let's throw some girls in. Let's make one a bald
Yeah.
badass.
Sure.
And then the other one, let's go with the cliches. And then
Yeah.
someone in the writers group was probably like, maybe we need a little girl power in there. Let's punch it up,
Yeah.
literally, figuratively.
Well, yeah,
And then
and-
it just cycles back.
I mean, why? I mean, we don't really cover this in here, but why is, and forgive me, why it skips my name, right? The name skips my name. Well, no, the writer's character, like her,
Choice.
Joyce, her inciting incident is that magnets don't work. That's the thing. That's the
They were
hill she's
listening
going to
to
die on.
ICP
She
that
decides of all the
Yeah.
things that have happened in her life, and all the things with her son and her family, and all the stuff that she's had to cope with. Suddenly, she's teed off that magnets don't work, and that's what propels her arc. It's frustrating. You go, what are they doing? Why is that interesting or in a moment like that used very specifically, because they use it several times.
I
So
kind
they
of
don't
feel
need to
like that
remind us
about.
of it, but they keep bringing it up. Why a magnet? Why? What is that about that?
I
I'm
kind of
just
feel like
gonna-
that way all about the entire season 3. I'm just like, what happened? This was a great show. I don't.
Right.
You know?
It feels very much like the writers group was just kind of tossing out ideas. And my thing with the magnets is, Insane Clown Posse has that song "Miracles," which the
Okay.
line is "Magnets, how do they work?"
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my
I think Breaking Bad.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe we're the oldest ones here. To listen
No.
to you young whippersnappers.
Yeah.
We were young adults then in the 80s. The first part there about marginalizing a role, it just, I mean, you like this show a lot because it reflects the 80s, and that reflects the 80s.
Yeah.
9 to 5. The movie was all about that.
Yeah.
They gave Nancy towards the end, she got to be more of a hero, like Adventures in Babysitting.
Yeah.
Where it was all a woman. So I'm just kind of confused. I can see where you're trying to put, and believe me, I'm not anti-feminist or anything, but just, you like this show because it does reflect it, but then when it reflects part of it, and it does move her character arc a little bit.
Sure.
I'm just a little.
Oh, well,
confused.
we're going to get to it, sir. We're getting to it now.
All right.
Oh, Nancy, what? Oh, my heart! Protect me! Somebody save me!
You want to take it away, Tony?
What?
Yeah, this is your thing.
So, are women's concerns acknowledged, and are they equalized by diminishing men in the same way? So, this season took a hit on a few sites because of the example of how he's objectified by women around the pool, which was shot and very similarly executed in Fast Times at Ridgemont High when Phoebe Cates' character, Linda's in a very similar scene, where you have men ogling the women. And now you have, in this case, you have women who are ogling, in all essence, a teenage boy who's like 17. So where does the equivocation come in between what's the difference, why is that, and what's happening in our society where that's being used? So now, of course, that has a triggering aspect to it, but there's a purpose, I feel, in looking at it as a whole now, going, oh, there is a purpose to it. Is it nostalgic reflection, or is it doing a stereotype of a social commentary? What are the filmmakers' intent? Or is it up to us to infer and define that intent? Maybe they didn't intend it, but us as viewers, we're allowed to make that because it's our opinion. It's curious. It was definitely a curious thing, and certainly superficially you can look at it and go, inappropriate, not supposed to happen, you shouldn't do that in a thing, but it's also, because it's set in the 80s, that's very much how things were done. As Clayton mentioned, certainly with things like, Adventures in Babysitting. I mean, you have Michael Keaton's Mr. Mom. The whole movie's predicated around the idea of there being a turn in the social structure. And Terry Garr has to go to work and be the breadwinner, and he has to stay at home and do the quote-unquote easy job. So those types of turns are important because of when they're set. But we are watching it from a reflection of the past and applying a nostalgic filter to it.
I'll jump in on that Fast Times reference. I'm going to say I disagree. I do not think that it's a solid, mirrored with the gender parallel to it. Because with Fast Times, you've got the guys that are oogling the girl who's getting out of the pool, and so we kind of cut from just like their facial reaction to the girl in the swimsuit getting out of the pool, soaking wet, walking towards them.
In slow-mo, no less.
Oh, yeah.
But, of course, it does the same thing with Billy.
Well, does it, though? So
You're wrong!
Billy's character, though, yes, we do have that moment. You have that kind of nod to Fast Times. But we're not just going from, like, someone doing a close-up shot, tip the sunglasses, who's that, and then cut to him. It's showing him, yes, there's some objectifying of him, but then do we not also cut back to the moms that are by the pool and show their bodies and all of that? It's like it's not a balanced parallel between it, because I think then we're still leaning into we have to objectify women and show, instead of it being like, I'm a horny teenager
Sure.
looking at this almost naked girl, now it's like, ooh, you are a naughty, housewife that's out to cheat on your husband. I don't think that it's a fair parallel there. So that's my take on it. I think that Billy's objectification is just another slap back into not really a feminist move. That's my thought.
Not.
Yes.
That's kind of how I experienced it as well. Is it kind of like just overly sexualize these women as repressed beings, like, oh, I've got an ugly husband and I'm kind of sexy, but it was weird, and the tension was odd. I didn't think it was a very feminist move or a flip on an old stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that kind of goes back to what we're talking about with the writer's room and, the round table of saying, like, let's be progressive, let's throw something feminist. How about a half-naked guy instead of a girl? Oh, wait, but what about the ladies?
No, we'll play the Fast Times at Ridgemont High and do that. Well, they also use the trope of the husband as this, even compared to the other seasons, he's incredibly nerdy and disaffected and unawares, but he's a good father. He takes care of the daughter while the mother's out gallivanting and doing things, and that is very much an 80s type of thing, but the stereotypes turn, like in Fatal Attraction. You have, Michael Douglas is the one cheating, and his sins come back home to roost, and boiling the bunny and all that stuff. So if they're using a reverse gender role by doing that, my question is, why are they doing that? What is the use and function of doing something like that serve the story? And so the only two options that really kind of come up then is like, it's either leaning into the nostalgic reflection and just sort of modifying it so that we can identify what that trope is and go, oh, and then everybody gets fired up because they're like, well, that's not fair. Or are the writers and the filmmakers wanting to use that as leverage to make a comment about a societal norm that should be looked at? How is, like, in relief? Again, like Nancy. Nancy's defined by what she's not as much as what she does. And that is a very important part, I feel, of season 3. Why are these things happening in this way?
Right.
As opposed to, are they just serving a function of, like, memory, or are they serving a function of commentary?
I personally feel like it's both. I feel like we're leaning heavily into the nostalgia, because definitely when I saw that clip with Billy, of course, I'm thinking Fast Times. I mean, the hairdo, everything, like, super, super nostalgic. The makeup that the ladies have on is, like, quintessential 80s. So I think they're definitely leaning into that, but I think it's a social commentary come at it, like, the wrong way. I think they're trying to say, like, let's spin this around and have it be the guy being objectified.
Sure.
But it's not done right. And then I'm glad that you brought up the point about, I can't think of the mom's name, when she's the one that's gonna potentially cheat on her husband.
Karen.
Yeah, and when she goes home and sees her husband, it's like, oh yeah, he's the nerd, he's sleeping, he's not like this supermodel. But then later we also see, like, it kind of comes full circle that she really does love him and realizes what a great guy he is, instead of sort of the big dumb oaf trope that we see in a lot of 80s and 90s, like The Simpsons, Family Guy, all of those. You have, like, the hot wife and then the big dumb oaf of a dad, and it doesn't really come full circle where you're like, man, I love you so much, like, you are this great person. It's like at the end of the episode, they're still kind of dumb.
Well, in the last episodes, you show them together a lot of times either on a Ferris wheel going around, or they're in the magic wall where it's spinning, the drum is spinning, and she goes, wow, this is amazing. And she's together with her family in that. So it shows that sort of mixing of ideals together and her coming back into her own, like, if you will, sort of recentering where she's at. And the husband's still oblivious to what has happened, but you can tell there's definitely love there that's been reignited between those two scenes that happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thoroughly convinced by the feminist critique. At first, when you had her through the 3 seasons, I was like, well, isn't it somewhat satisfying that we as the audience know, like, in the newsroom, she's right? Again, the whole the relief of it, and the by, like, the opposite, the film negative kind of idea. But at the same time, it's like we're making an exception for the linguistics, we're making an exception for the portrayal of the Russians, we're making an exception for the mall wasn't really that big of a thing until the 90s. We're making all the exceptions. And a much more obvious example, but, like, when we were watching Game of Thrones, we were like, oh my God, it's just, just slaughtering women left and right. And, why can't we get a break from this, this misogyny? And, then the point always comes up, well, it was the Middle Ages, it wasn't exactly a feminist time, but it's like any time that the storytellers have an opportunity to retell, I mean, these are fantasy worlds to a certain degree, right? They don't take the opportunity. It's like 99% of these imagined worlds, it's not feminist.
Right. And
Why
I think
are we still being entertained by women being murdered and being treated badly, and even using this excuse that it was another time?
I think to jump to Clayton, when you were bringing up kind of the confusion of our back and forth going on here, I think, like, that's exactly it. Is I'm frustrated that we're not staying historically appropriate and we're doing the story through a current lens, but then we're still leaning into some of the kind of negative tropes of the era. And I think that's where I get frustrated, but majority of it is with season 3.
It's wildly frustrating for exactly that reason. And it's disabling to a degree to look at it and say, why are they cherry picking their moments and to what extent and purpose are those functioning as an arc in the overall series, let alone just this season. Yeah, I mean, if you don't like the gender politics going on here, wait till we get to the cognitive diversity section.
Do you want to jump in with a comment?
Yeah, I think that even as I'm listening to this and reflecting on my own experience with the show, that nostalgia and that living vicariously, those sort of forgive or even like gloss over some of these things that we might use even more of a critical lens if we didn't have like the nostalgic glasses on. So it's interesting listening to these things because you're watching it and you're like, oh, a time before all the social complexities of our political
Can I just be
landscape.
entertained?
In the 80s when women were oppressed and cars were really cool. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Hair was really great.
and clothes were really great.
Yeah,
Right,
no
right.
kidding. Music was really good.
But it
Okay.
feels like nostalgia covers a multitude of sins, to say.
Yeah.
And yeah, the question I'm posing is why?
Yeah.
Why is
Yeah.
it being weaponized in a certain way? Maybe weaponized is too harsh a term. Maybe why is it being commerced or commercialized in that way?
Well,
Which parallels, of course, the commerce that happens in the show. I mean, why does it take place in a
well, for
in
me,
a this whole vacuum of this whole universe of a mall, which we've come to understand now? They've all crumbled and fallen apart. Now there's the concept of small town America in the gentrification of stores on the main street with apartments above it, and it's a walking situation. We've swung back the other way from this ideal, like, oh, we want the central suburban, keep the commerce away from our houses. Now our houses are part of the commerce
first we
section.
had the mall, then we had Home Depot, then we had Walmart. And
Yeah, well, and certainly online has changed it. Everything's done online. Anyways, we're probably gonna get too far in the weeds, and we'll be, like I said, midnight before we get to it.
Did you want to add something quick? before
Oh,
we move
yeah,
on?
I just, for me, the nostalgia thing, part of it is like putting up with like what that says about the way women were treated in the 80s. It's like we all, like as individuals, like to be seen and understood for what we've gone through. So when I say like, oh, that's what it felt like, I want you all to know that, you know, I mean, that to me, that's a lot what the Me Too movement is saying now too. It's like, we've been quiet, all of us women, for so long about the way we've been treated. Thank you for finally listening. Thank you for finally like letting us talk openly about things that the way people are harassed on a daily basis, and just go, oh, I don't have to like just like shrug it off and go, oh, that's the way things are. We can talk about it now.
So maybe this show's kind of gently shining a light on that, the frustrations of
Maybe.
women.
I don't
Gentle.
I don't know if it is.
I
I'm
don't know
just
how
saying
gentle
that
it
I
is.
might forgive a lot of that because I feel seen when I see a young girl in the 80s going through that and go,
Yeah.
that's real.
It's funny you should mention that because
Oh.
we go to cognitive diversity. So if you take out the gender specifics in it, but still service why there's a critical lens from now to the 80s, what service does it have to go from season 1 till now, watching, this is my interpretation of what I'm seeing. This doesn't necessarily make it right or wrong or the equal to what you all may see, but I see 11 went from this naive girl who's been compartmentalized and grown basically in a lab to being the socially inept tweener, which we've all really understand, but now she's railing against patriarchy. And in my opinion, her behavior was indicative of a child on the spectrum, as opposed to someone who was just not able to figure out social cues. And I'm like, why did what's the filmmaker's commentary about children on the spectrum then, if you're looking at it from now versus then? I mean, now we're much more educated on that, with the understanding of what's going on there, but why even sort of lean or go into that sort of as a parody between now and then? And again, as Shirley mentioned about the Me Too movement, why are they championing miscommunication? Because they're taking joy in that. The girl, 11, and her friend, Billy's sister, they're like, this is how you're supposed to treat people. This is how gender dynamics work between our communications. And they spent a lot of energy creating these misnomers that right now are aberrant, but then are very much of the time in which they are. But why do they do it? And to me, it was just like one of those things of going, Wow, that's so very apparent. They put a lot of energy that doesn't move the story forward, but it's very much about investing in the character's point of view. So what do us as the viewers get out of that? If it's not meant to move the story forward, what's the purpose for the characters to go through that contention? Or is it just there to fill time? I'm curious. What do you think?
Yeah, this is maybe a bit of a reach and sort of dark, but maybe it's just what the market is ready for. Like, I've heard it said that Netflix has really, really good data on like every trope that their market loves, millennials and otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Every, you know, like, so maybe we could just boil it all down to like it was just marketable and they just decided,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is an easy sell. It's really funny to watch if you're not thinking too critically about it. So
God, I hope we're not getting that point where they're walking in with marketing data in the writer's room and just going, well, you got to put in the thing with autism, but don't mention it.
I'm sorry, the AIs are writing all the scripts, sorry.
Oh, no! What do you think, Sarah? Do you
No,
think that's
I
where
think-
we're getting?
I think that's exactly it. I think,
Wow.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think that they do have a lot of data, and season 3 especially felt like a different season. It feels like
Sure.
a fresh room of writers, and it feels like they're just trying to lean really hard into different trends and what's hot. I'm going to say I completely disagree with the first statement there and it going down the avenue of autism. I didn't pick up on any of that. My takeaway, and I'm curious to hear other people's opinion, Eleven's character has always been, limited with her language and based on how she was raised in that facility. And so I take that kind of like socially inept and limited communication to be more of a parallel to like, an alien or something like that, like trying to communicate with ET or, something to that effect. I feel like she is a higher being or a different being, and that's what that disconnect is. I was really surprised by this comment because I didn't take it as anything on the spectrum at all. But what did you all think about her character and kind of leaning hard into that, her inability to communicate, her kind of, stunted growth with cultural expectations, that sort of thing? What do we think? Yeah.
To me, it felt like a reaction to extreme trauma in her life and extreme expectation to save the world. I mean, I think that would do a lot to any of us. So yeah, I definitely didn't see it as indicative of somebody on the spectrum, rather somebody who has literally the weight of the world of humanity on their shoulders,
Right.
and is going through a lot to process that. And trauma will do a great deal to people. And kind of to backtrack a little bit about the comments about Billy's character and the objectification, yeah, that didn't really feel like a feminist comment to me either. There was some nostalgia there. It also reminds me a little bit of like Billy's character being the birth of the monster in this new way. And if you think about the things that are around him, it's very birth driven, right? Like there's the pool, there's the water, there's like the blueness, like there are all these themes of birth and also of death that are around his character. And so for me, the pool scene and like the fact that he's in a bathing suit, like the naked aspect of it, that all really makes sense. And I didn't, yeah, it's a bit uncomfortable to think of like a teenager sleeping with, somebody's parent. I didn't enjoy that aspect of it. It did make me uncomfortable, but it was much less about the political or the social statement and way more about like, okay, what are they trying to get across here? It reminds me of like Frankenstein's monster, or like if you think about the Rocky Horror Picture Show and Frankenfurter's Rocky, and there are a lot of like scenes with like water there too. So yeah, I think some of these are really interesting points, and I didn't get to that point. I didn't think about the autism spectrum. I didn't think about the objectification.
I really like that point. I think that's a neat way to look at it, about his character being more like the metaphor for birth and all of that. I think that's fantastic. Thank you for bringing that up.
I just remembered too, when she said the teen boy with the parents, there's several 80s era movies about that, about like a teen, not a teenager, but like a
Even though, yeah, the
college
graduate.
freshman age kid sleeping with his roommate's mother or something. That was a whole 80s thing I'd forgotten about, so.
There's a lot of interesting anachronistic things happening in this series. Things like you wouldn't see Mike arguing with with Hopper about why it's okay to kiss 11 with the door closed. That's just not going to happen. In the 80s, he's sitting in the car, it's like, well, it's like, dude, why are you not listening to the adults in the room? And then worst of all, why is Hopper so concerned about making sure that his point is taken as empathetic? And this is how you talk to kids. I don't recall adults or the way parents behaved, certainly in the 80s, as a way of like making sure my emotions were properly in check and that I felt good about myself to make sure that I wasn't going to grow up with this misconception about how people talk to one another. They're very specific about why they do that, and it feels anachronistic. They may be the way parents talk with children now because the internet has totally changed the dynamic about how sex and everything has been operated. But holy cow, watching his interaction with Hopper in the car, and I'm going, he's either manipulating her or she's not aware of the manipulation, yet she's able to move objects and read minds and do all these kinds of things. To me, it struck me as like, why are they moving her from being naive to somebody who now can't register or read social cues? Now, whether or not that's my misunderstanding of how there's a definition to autism on the spectrum, I will fully admit that. But to me, it felt like, at least stereotypically, the way it operates, I'm going, man, what are they doing? Why are they making that choice? Another lesser point, but equally as important, is when Mike confronts the kid, again, I'm sorry, I forget some of these names, the son who gets lost, right? And in the first season, the father rejects him because he goes, well, he's gay. And then in the third season, Mike confronts him, he says, just because you don't like the people that I like doesn't mean that I'm going to dismiss you. I like to meet the teenage boy back then that didn't behave differently towards his friend because he thought he was gay. That to me is also anachronistic. Now that would happen.
I'm okay with them changing that and making
I'm not fighting for any specific dynamic. I'm saying the way that things are looked at now in the context versus then. That's a false equivocation to sit there and say, hey, that's not fair, not this. This we can pick and choose and cherry pick this moment, but this moment we're not going to do because it would make people uncomfortable. And marketing data probably did have a great influence in how that is. Or like, ooh, we don't want to push these buttons. But in sidestepping some of those landmines, they also lay out tripwires for other things.
Well, it almost just seems like we could put two columns on the board and take any number of these different issues and tropes and social issues and just put them on like historically accurate or modern day.
Sure.
Like, is there any sort of formula to what they decided to modernize and what they decided to keep sort of nostalgic and historical?
Right. And my supposition is that there's a reason for them to create these two poles, these dynamics. And why did they pick one to lean into and one to say, we're not going to go down that road? And whether that means I'm giving more credit to the writers and the filmmakers than they appropriately deserve, I certainly hope so. I like to think that I'm a writer that would be able to contextualize this properly while writing and not just some widget from Netflix walked in and went, now you got to pick the top 3 aspects and put that in the script or you don't get paid. So why does season 3 have a tone deafness to it? And then how can we reconcile that with the other 2 seasons when quite frankly, they just didn't have that kind of leverage or heat on it now for the observation?
It doesn't seem to have the emotional depth in season 3 that it had for the previous 2.
Yeah, is there a way to reconcile it? And I'm positing that there is, personally. I don't know whether they'll agree, but I suspect that there is a way to do this.
I want to take it back. We just went down like 500 different spider webs of things, but I want to take it back
39
to
steps. Hitchcock would be very proud of us right now.
your point of bringing up the dynamic with Hopper and Mike, and then 11 kind of in that whole mix, and you talked about empathy, and then about your argument of that kind of solidifies why you feel like she...
You mean our argument?
why you feel like she
Are we
is
arguing?
representing, someone on the spectrum. I'm gonna say the empathy thing. Yes, I think that's another example of like showing the '80s not historically appropriate and through the modern lens.
Sure.
And I think that that's just kind of trying to show some progression there. But as far as that being an example of, well, they're speaking for 11, she can't speak for herself, they're making these decisions. No, I think that's going back on the F word again of not so feminist, that you have 11, a girl, can't decide for herself. This is a thing for guys to have a heart-to-heart about, that you shouldn't, make out with my daughter. She doesn't have any say in this. I think that that's what that dynamic is.
Well, then my question would be, how do you reconcile Billy's sister telling her, this is how you treat men, this is how you're supposed to behave, this is the way we get them to do what we want them to do, make them give you gifts, make them give you presents.
I think that's
She's
all
very
just...
specific and very pointed about exactly the steps it takes to miscommunicate and obfuscate. But why then does it come from her as apparently this surrogate to how women should behave, but putting in the voice of another teenage girl? That's where I get really frustrated.
It's sloppy because we're trying to be progressive and then try to be 80s appropriate.
Sure.
And I think their dynamic, what is the sister's name? I forget.
Max.
Max,
Yes, thank you.
Max
even
and 11,
a masculine name, right? So you're like, what's the dynamic here? And that's what I'm asking is why the qualifications for certain things, and is there a way out for the filmmakers to be able to have their cake and eat it too? Can they still write a story based in the 80s while contextualizing it for the here and now?
They're not. I'm going to say I don't think they're doing a good job of it. And I think that Max and 11's dynamic in season 3 is where it's most frustrating, because I feel that's where it's taking so many steps back that it's like, yay, a makeover is what's going to solve everything, and let's talk about boys, and let's manipulate them. I feel like that's just leaning way back into these like 80s female cliches that's just so frustrating, because we've come so far with other characters, but it's just like, why do you need to do that? Why does 11 need a makeover? Right. It's so out of her character. Yeah.
Didn't they dress up E.T. for Halloween though?
Yes.
But E.T.'s not as cool as 11.
You pick some really valid points about it being very regressive.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm suggesting is you can't have regression without demonstrating the relief of progression. Why are they demonstrating a progress by throwing it back in the 80s and pulling these certain moments out that really stick out like sore thumbs on a show that's celebrating nostalgia, would be my assertion. Why are they doing that? And again, I completely agree with you. Watching season 3 was amazingly frustrating. At the end of it, I'm going, well, that's it. I don't have to watch this show anymore. And again, thankfully for you all, in the anxiety I get like trying to sit up here going, oh my God, what am I going to say or do? I went back and kind of re-examined why I felt that way. And is there an out that's legitimate without it being this golden parachute of like, well, we're just going to write what we want. And I feel like there's a way to do that and still reconcile both halves, that whether we agree with it or not, there's the potential for it. And I think that really pinwheels on the difference between, well, we're going to get to it, the difference between the nostalgia. What is my, prove it, you son of a, what is it? I think it has to do with both, sort of like the way we commercialize nostalgia now. It clearly is, and that's not like it wasn't done in the 80s. Remember in the 80s there was a big deal about like the 50s. So it seems like every 20 years there's this sort of cartwheel into romanticizing things. So if we're going to romanticize the 80s through this show, what is its purpose and function to serving the story and the narrative now? Why do we need to do that? So the only way you can do that is by serving as a relief to what our expectations are. So when we bump into these things that are like, it wouldn't happen that way, it shouldn't happen that way, why are they talking this way? I think those are guideposts or road flares because it triggers. They piss us off. Why are they pissing us off?
But if that's the case, I feel like they would have wrapped it up and had the golden parachute in this season.
We will get to that. Won't we?
So we will, yes.
To me, the whole third season was about teenage awkwardness and trying to get you to feel that awkwardness in a way, and with like Max and 11 and her telling 11 how to treat boys, and that's just a lot of what teenagers did during that time period. I think they're probably still doing it now.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Sometimes a cigar is just
Well,
a cigar.
you know, well, the difference is now they relate to things in the context of culture through this.
Right.
And in '85, it was the VHS. Right? I mean, the culture and
kids-
society
yeah,
of
the
what it
kids
was
you ran
is
around with in your
you
neighborhood.
ran around with, you got the VHS, or you went to the movies, or you listened to music. It was high-powered culture through the radio, through television, through movies. Those are the three things. Now, it's the entire world in your pocket.
Right.
So the distraction, it's like it's an inch deep, but it's a mile wide. Back then, 3 stations, and your friend might have cable that you could go watch some shows at TV that were rated R after 9 o'clock.
Get a cassette
Or
tape
you
and
could
tape
get
yourself
cassette
off the
tape and you
radio.
could tape things off of it, or you can. It's also the first time we could start displacing when we could watch stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to acknowledge the displacement of what's happening compared to how we define displacement now.
Well, I think this might lead into what you're going to say
It
next.
could be!
But I want to suggest that...
Hey, let's have some ice cream. It's all good.
It's not
Ice cream
only-
fixes everything, in my opinion.
But I mean, it
Yeah.
is. Let's be
It's
real.
not only about teens learning... Oh, wait, what does this say? Yes, this is what this works. I was going to say it's not only about teens learning how to grow up, it's also about how difficult it is to be middle-aged, because I see that in Hopper, I see that in Joyce, I see that in Nancy's mother. I mean, I don't think she's having a midlife crisis, but I think she's like kind of... When you're in middle age, and I am, so I understand, it's a lot like when you're a teenager, because you're like trying to figure out what's next. You're trying to, your body's changing physically, and your emotions and your hormones, all like when you're a teenager, and you're just...
I'll take your word for it.
You do silly things.
I'll be a teenager someday. It's
You're
by
like-
no
you-
accident that you have someone like Joyce, played by Winona Ryder, who's the ingenue in the 80s.
Yeah.
And then you also have Sean Astin, who was just beloved for his character in The Goonies, and then, of course, subsequently as an arc through, and then he gets aced in season 2, but only to be brought back in some ways spiritually as a bit of nostalgia in season 3. So why don't we go ahead and talk about an interesting moment of parallel in the story mechanics. Where did these 2 points converge, right? So in the middle of season 3, episode 4, which is right in the middle of the series, and in stories you have your hook, you have your end of your first act, you have the middle, which is usually about a reflection of proportions between main characters. But when you have an ensemble, there's some sort of usually an emotional leverage or anchor point where the characters switch from being reactive to proactive. So in some ways, this series pivots to me on this scene that moves from being reactive to proactive. But why? So we'll touch on a little bit after that, but there's this really interesting moment between mother and daughter, and it's so interesting and different that I had to track it down and find. Thank God it was online. I was like, okay, we can do this. So hit it, boss. It's about 3 minutes long.
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry. I actually don't have audio piped in from here, so I think we'll have to pull this up afterwards. I'm sorry, I totally ruined that for you.
But you need it. You're going to have to find a way to turn up and stick something in there. Or what was the point?
Yeah, we'll have to come back to that point after, but we're also kind of tight on time, so I'm sorry.
I
that
know,
we'll-
we murdered it then because...
Well, this is the end, isn't it, of the conversations? And isn't it the end of
Right, so this will be the end of the presentation. So essentially what happens is that you have mother and daughter confronting the difference between becoming an adult and being an adult. And they talk about the stresses that come from exactly what happens to Nancy in a way that's almost expositional. And by touching on that, she tells her daughter things are tough for us. Things are difficult. And in my mind, she's not just talking about human beings. She's talking about what it's like to be in a society where women are marginalized and diminished, where people of different spectrums and choices are marginalized and diminished. And you have, look at me, Nancy, finish it, ... Why not? So it's also one of the few moments in this series where they're not talking about men. They're talking about things that literally are about the issues at hand. It peels away the structure of the rest of the story, the plot, the characters, and talks to us directly as the viewer about the difference of investing in our past and respecting where we came from, but don't use that as an excuse not to tell your story and move your process and what you have to say in the social narrative right now moving forward, Nancy. Take what you've learned, take where I've lifted you to this spot and set it aside. And she even mentions about how her father, she goes, I must get it from Dad. And they laugh it off, but really she goes, no, actually, Mom, I get that from you. And her mom tells her, take it and go with it. And if you think about the parallels that this has become a way now, more than ever, where you have millennials and Generation Z looking at their structure and where they're at in the story of our society and going, we respect where it came from. We understand we didn't start the fire, but that they actually have to be the fire bearers now and taking it forward. And that, to me, is a great way on how to reconcile where season 3 ends up compared to, say, the first 2 seasons. Because why are they spending all this time on something known as the upside down? They haven't even touched on what the purpose or the function of what that is. So to me, the question of why are we even in this when I wanted werewolves and zombies and vampires, that kind of story, I thought that's what Stranger Things would be about. But even the title suggests what we're in for moving forward in this series, and I'm curious if it will go this way. If this won't actually end up being the middle of the series itself, if it goes to season 5, it probably will, that the entire series would pivot off of this specific scene and why it's important for us to sit there and look at it. I mean, Last Jedi, you have Kylo Ren does the exact same type of speech with Rey about just you have to throw the past away. We can start over right now by destroying everything that everybody else stood for and reinventing the wheel. And I'm not suggesting that they need to reinvent the wheel, but certainly in the context of nostalgia, why are they spinning all of this stuff around from these different angles and throwing in these different socio-ideological necessities if it doesn't serve a function for us later to watch as a society 30, 40, 50 years from now and go, what an interesting snapshot of 2019 compared to 1985 compared to maybe 2035 or 2045. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
So I have a question then, who is this show for? Is it for someone my age who has nostalgia, and in that case the answer is they want my money because I'm gonna go pay for Netflix to get this because I have to see myself in the 80s? Or is it for young people who are like want to have the, it's both?
I think Netflix walks in with their thing and they slap it on the table and they go, you need to say this, this, and this. And then in order for those to have definition and meaning, in order for lightness to have definition, you need darkness. And for darkness to be defined, it needs light. So in order for this series to have its definition, I feel like that, well, I know just as a story mechanic, that is what it needs to be able to do it. Now, whether or not they succeed or they think about how that goes forward, or if somebody walks in with another thing and say, this time chocolate ice cream is the most important thing we can talk about, it'll be interesting to see if they use that as the leverage point, the pivot point for the entire series. About, yes, we're going back and looking at this with nostalgia, but it's not with legitimate eyes of what happened then. It's with what's happening now and how you can use those pieces to tell your story moving forward.
I think it's an interesting observation. Honestly, when I watched this season, this scene, I just kind of like glossed over with it. I didn't see it being so significant. And
it sticks out like a sore thumb because it is one of the few Bechdel passing tests. There's so much stuff all the time where you realize Billy's always in charge or boys or this, and it's like, man, this scene comes out of nowhere and it's so well performed and the characters are so well centered on what's happening with their own selves that they're more self-aware in those scenes than they are in any other parts of the series. Not just them, but the entire series as a whole, to me, rests on specifically this scene literally in the middle of the entire season.
What do you all think? Did anyone else feel that this scene?
Well, geez, they can't because they haven't seen it yet.
Do you want to explain what the Bechdel test is?
So the Bechdel test is where, well, you know what? I should be explaining it. That's probably where I should step off and allow the experts in those things and why it's important for women to have scenes where women talk to one another. I should step down from that.
It's been a minute since I referenced it, but I know it was like a test that had 3 rules to it of like, I think it was a minimum of 2 female characters in a scene.
Mm-hmm.
Are they talking to each other, and are they talking to each other about something other than boys?
That's pretty much it.
I think
Yeah,
that's
that's
just
it.
so when
Something
you pass
me-
it, you
Well,
get all
something
3.
meaningful. They're discussing something meaningful between themselves that's integral to the plot and or character of who they are, and it doesn't involve their relationship to men as the central thematic of why they have to discuss things with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And usually when they fail it, it ends up being like, oh, it's like the Little Women thing. Oh, will he come and find me and save me? Will he take care of me? That's where that comes from. Because if you look at the way movies have been put together, it's the same thing with the trope known as Phrygian women, where you kill the main love interest in the first act only to give motivation to the male character to race through the film and commit tragic, ravenous revenge on everybody for doing it. That's the same thing that the Bechdel test does for women interacting with each other in movies. And you find it in the most interesting things. Movies that you think would do that really well, like Mary, Queen of Scots, fails it immensely. And then you have movies like Queen or Bohemian Rhapsody that actually managed to pull it off. You're like, holy cow, how does that happen? So it's interesting when you can find those nuggets of scenes in different movies and realize this movie's crap, but at least they pulled off a really good scene between 2 women that had nothing to do with a guy and or the plot revolving around the guy achieving his goal.
Shirley, do you want to add anything? How do you feel as a woman seeing this scene? Do you feel it's as pivotal as Tony is saying?
It remains to be seen whether it's defines the whole series. I think that's an interesting observation. But
The great thing is we won't know until about 5 years from now. And then I'll be somewhere Africa or Belize or something.
That's Belize. Little tribe reference.
Yeah.
I think it's a very meaningful scene, though. I mean, it comes back to the 2 things I talked about: middle age and teenage years, where you're trying to like kind of figure out who you are, and you see the mother just being like. There's some moments where she looks at her and she's like, "Do it!" Like she doesn't say the words "I didn't," but you kind of get that feeling like, "I really want you to not be afraid to fight back from people trying to discriminate or oppress or whatever."
And she didn't refresh the slides because I can see I had that in red. It was so cool.
Oh, stop.
I had such an
Sorry,
aesthetic
I totally failed
happening.
you. Shirley, I want to jump back to your point of, you were asking like, who is this show made for?
Yeah.
And then you say, well, it's confusing because, you know, you like it because it's nostalgic and it's this moment for you to be able to be like, yeah, that's what life was
Yeah.
like. But then you're
I think
also
it's both.
like,
yeah,
as a middle-aged woman, you know, looking through it with that lens. So it's poetic that you have this moment that is those 2 lives, those 2 lenses kind of coming together and working together. So I think that's neat. I'm glad that you brought up those points. Let's jump on to the big question of the evening and the last one. What does the upside down represent? And I want to throw this one out to the audience of what do you guys interpret that to mean? Is it real? Is it imaginary? Is it a commentary on something? What do we think?
There's only wrong answers at this point. So
I personally wanted to represent cosmic horror coming into the series, you know? That it was going to be maybe like a cabin in the woods kind of thing, like you never know what's gonna emerge, you know?
I too wanted
they're
that.
playing.
I want mermaids.
The thing is, they're playing D&D, and that was the opening. You know, we're sold this voucher, you know, with many other things that, you know, as in the Facebook era, you're sold this like slid this golden voucher of, you know, you make it what you think it is, but then it comes loaded with all these other things, you know, and you know, and it's low concept versus high concept, and really it's pushing more towards the, you know, high concept mark on a lot of it, you know. And you're thinking, oh, well, it could be really fun, you know. This could be really a fun, you know, script writing tool, you know. Just like what you're saying with D&D, you know, this could be an entryway to like all kinds of just weird dimensions coming in, you know, like a Rick and Morty type thing, you know,
Right,
Rick and Morty
yeah.
forever, 100timesover.com, you know, but it wasn't, you know. So.
Yeah.
Well, and do we ever hear what their campaign is that they're playing? I mean, maybe they're playing a couple of them, but is the Upside Down supposed to be one of their D&D campaigns? Could be. It might be.
Maybe they never ended it. Maybe they were always in it.
They're in it now. They took some
Yeah.
mushrooms, and it's all in someone's head.
And by campaign, I mean the story that you create, kind of like the world that you're playing D&D in. You can create your own world and take all these adventures through there. So this Upside Down could be one of those campaigns, which would be
It's 11 in the isolation tank having a fever dream, like Altered States.
That could be
That's
it.
it. We solved it.
Yep,
That's
all right,
it.
we're done.
I kind of want it to be more like X-Files, where there's monsters and aliens, and it's never really figured out where they came from. They're just like, they appear, they come in and out of the universe, and things happen, and there's mysteries.
Well, maybe it's like, maybe this is the prequel to Men in Black before they
Yeah.
start working with
But I
aliens.
don't really understand why they
Well,
close
yeah,
it
the
up
way
and
they-
then it's still a thread, and then
Yeah, the way they played the end of the series, I almost felt it would have been more interesting, because clearly that's Hopper, the American in the cousin. It would be more interesting if Hopper was in the underneath or the upside down, and as Joyce leaves the house, the light would kind of flicker, like he's trying to catch her attention, and then they cut to black. That would have been far more interesting a way to end it than this whole like, pull the guy out. No, leave the American in his hole. You're going, okay, got it.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what they do next. If it'll be return to form, or if it's going to be continuing down the same path of
too many
this
plot lines in this series,
this thing.
season.
But that's like D&D. It can go
Is
all
it?
over the
Okay.
place.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's the fun of it.
A lot
Seems
of
like
books.
the Upside Down is a parallel universe. It's like Golden Compass there.
Yeah.
You're cutting your way into a different world. You got to keep that intersection closed, otherwise it's going to mess everything up. But
Exactly. It's like where are we? So if there's an upside down and there's the mind flayer and there's all these demigorgons around here, what do they represent in the real world? Where are those actual creatures? Because if we don't exist in the upside down as totems, what are those things invisible up here? Is it the zeitgeist? Is it the pressure and the sense of like dread, the existential dread of nuclear annihilation, or hate and fear? It's a fascinating concept. Where are they underpinning each other, and why are they there? Why is there a need for an upside
Is it
down
all a
in the
government
story?
experiment and they put something in the water to make us believe that it's...
Who knows?
Well, I feel like my personal opinion is kind of what Tony's getting at, is that it's the stuff that's not literally existing in our current world, but the zeitgeist, those hidden fears, the what if, the all that. Because I mean, when you're in the upside down, you see that everything's like super overgrown. You have these otherworldly creatures in there. You have ash kind of falling all the time. It's toxic. You can't breathe in there without oxygen. So it makes me think, like, is this an environmental commentary?
Well,
You know,
if
something
you want
like that?
If you want a tent pole where it happens, I mean, if you think about the things in a structural pyramid, what's the thing that happens pretty much between 1985 and now? 9/11. Ash in the air, the whole world's changed, there's a darkness that's overcome everything. Is that the turning point? Is that the flip over? That you have this emotional turning of who we were as a society and how we thought and perceived things that were a certain sort of romantic, nostalgic point of view, like, oh, everything's so much better, make America great, versus now where you have this terrorist threat and the terror of our own CGI of our minds controlling the choices because, ooh, don't say that, don't do this, you'll piss someone off, and there's frustration between the two poles that really comes from that type.
Even though there was the fear of
it literally flays the mind
of the Russians in the 80s, there was also this sense of like that can never happen here until 9/11.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think we had another thought over here.
I was just thinking about, like, I think you were saying, I can't remember your name, sorry.
Shirley.
Shirley, about the, like, that's right, she made the airplane joke. That I don't want it solved. Some things are better left as a mystery. I mean, you'll get Star Wars and say metachlorians, for instance.
Oh yeah,
I didn't want to know how the Force works. I would rather just be left a mystery. We don't know how the Upside Down came to be, how it's there. Just leave it as a mystery. Just some things are better left.
I got a feeling they're not going to do that. I got a feeling that isn't where it's going to land on this ninth episode. So.
Any other thoughts on?
It's a fascinating mind gymnastics to kind of do that. It's like, I mean, you can either go that way with it or just, I wish they would just get killer mermaids and vampires and do that because I want, yeah, exactly.
Killer mermaids
I too want to be.
Come up a couple times. I think I need to see
well,
that.
When well, you should. It's got Sigourney Weaver in it.
There's a real movie with killer mermaids. What am I missing?
We'll talk to you afterwards. We're going to fill you in on Cabin in the Woods.
I think we had a comment over here. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just kind of making stuff up, but
aren't we all?
That's what we're here for.
Yeah, sort of a glib answer potentially, but maybe it's just it's like the rarefied anxiety and trauma that allows these characters to rise to the occasion in real life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when you have if the stakes every season are going to be what's the terror from the Upside Down, how's it going to infiltrate this time, that gets old pretty fast. Because we know that the universe can't be destroyed or there can't be a story. So what are the stakes? Well, if the stakes are the same thing every season, what's the purpose of having those stakes remain the same and the characters their evolution keeps vacillating? So what is the point of the show? And maybe I'm overreaching or interjecting because I want reason to take over at this point, but I have to believe that there's a purpose or a function why this exists now as opposed to 10 years from now, or opposed to why it didn't come out 12 years ago.
I'm middle-aged now and I can get my money.
That clearly follow the money, and that comes down to throwing the Venn diagram on the thing and going, you know what would be really cool? So, I don't know. What is it?
Well,
what could it be?
Why don't we jump to just general questions, thoughts, anything else that you guys
I love that you said parallel universe. I was like, yes! Thank you.
Any closing remarks? Anything from the whole conversation? Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious about your professional thoughts on the scene with Steve and Robin at the end, where they kind of flipped your expectations on they're going to end up as a couple, that kind of overdone trope. And, she became a LGBTQ inspiration then.
I was thinking about that in a sense of, like, do you remember Dabney Coleman's character in Tootsie? Where he's like he's sexist and... Well, there's a point where Dustin Hoffman reveals himself as that he was acting as a woman, he was a man acting as a woman the whole time. And Dabney Coleman's character says, I knew there was a reason she didn't like me. I feel like Joe is kind of like that character, even though you see him evolving in the way he treats women a little bit. Mm-hmm. But when it's almost to me in my mind like he was like, oh, she doesn't like men, that's why she didn't like me.
You're talking about Steve?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's not what you were asking, but
no,
I wanted to...
That's something to do.
Well, it certainly touches on that whole, like, there's an 80s bit to it that, yeah. I haven't considered it.
I like her
and I just end up
character.
Just spinning something else out of thin air, which I've probably done enough tonight. So.
What?
I love that
Yeah.
they became like best friends.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like, oh, it turned into a relationship. Of course it did. And me being part of the LGBT community, it's great to see representation too, and especially something that's set in the 80s, where it
Yeah,
wasn't
for
really
sure.
a thing, wasn't really talked about.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just like, how are they spinning that in the 80s look? When
Yeah,
it's one of
it's-
those things again when they shift.
It'll be interesting because it's definitely a different thought process on how things were done then versus now, and how are they going to address it moving forward. I'd be curious to see what they'll do. Or if there was Netflix to just freak out with Disney Plus and go, well, end of season 4.
Yeah, I think for me it was just a happy surprise that I wasn't really sure where it was going to go, and I guess I was thinking, if anything, it was going to go with a cliche of they end up together. And I think how it was subtly folded in was nice and felt kind of progressive,
Yeah.
which is, it's refreshing, but it's also frustrating that the whole rest of the season and all the other characters are not in that realm. But this, I think it was a nice, subtle, not like shoving it down your throat. It's just a very gentle shift of their relationship into more of a friendship instead of, a sexual tension or anything like that. So, yeah, I'm glad they added that.
I'm glad it was underscored, but it's so underscored I don't really recall it. I'd have to go back and watch it.
Oh, I do.
That's the part that's kind of
When
surprising.
they're sitting on the bathroom floor and you're like, ew, they're just like laying on the
Yeah.
bathroom floor.
That is pretty. Well, I kept thinking about how he could take so many punches to the body and not be dead. Honestly, I was
That's
like,
a
man,
very
you could look mean at
powerful,
somebody. And
Emotional scene. It was one of the best scenes in season 3.
Yeah.
If not the best
Yeah.
scene.
I disagree with the best scene. I think the best scene is the one.
I said one of, if not. we can fight over which
We're not
one's
gonna-
first or
we don't have
second.
You
to
can
fight.
take it
I'll
out
buy
back
ice
in a
cream.
minute.
and
Ice
I'll
cream's
take-
a- ice
Ice cream
cream.
fixes everything.
Yeah.
Every time. If that's all you walk away from tonight from the Stranger Things conversation, it's not waffles. It's ice cream
Ice
and
cream.
waffle cones.
Anyway, all right, what other thoughts do we have? Any other notes or bits of input?
If you think Sarah's full of shit, just tell her. She's
No.
okay with it.
No, I'm full of shit.
Well, why don't we end it on that happy
Yeah,
note?
we can't end it. We got this yet.
All right, I'll
So-
go back to the black so you're not blinded. Yeah.
So, we have a door prize. Now, in order to do this fair, I'm going to try to watch all of you this, so not by yelling it out, whoever's hand comes up first. Okay, I'm going to try to ask that. So, yeah, look, you're all like,
Yeah.
okay, so,
Get ready.
4th of July weekend, 1985, is a massively important time in culture because one of the greatest movies ever made debuted that weekend. What movie was it?
Not Star Wars.
No, ma'am.
No.
That's it.
What was it? What was your guess?
What was the Men in Black? Oh, look at that. She's doing it by elimination. See? By relief,
Yeah, they
you
got
have it
some-
defined. Yes.
E.T.?
82? Close, but that was in June of 82. Anyone else? Clayton? No guesses?
John
Yes.
Wick.
No!
Yes, John Wick. You win by
Indiana Jones.
No, that's a wonderful guess. So you have 82, 84, and 89.
I just couldn't remember which
Yeah,
one it was.
close.
Give him a clue.
I so want to give a clue, but I know the minute I do, people are going to start punching each other.
It's not that great a prize. No one's gonna find.
Yeah, no, I would. This would drive me nuts. 1.21 gigawatts.
Back to the Future.
Yes. There you go. Look, see? Almost left
There
to
you
punch
go.
in the air.
Thank you.
I almost did something like Lone Pine Mall, and you guys are too esoteric. That's crazy talk.
So with that, thank you guys for coming out. Special shout out to Thriller Chiller for being here tonight and hosting
Thank you
this
for having us. Thank you for entertaining
thought-provoking
the discussion.
discussion. And then up next, if you enjoyed this, Screen Club is actually going to be kind of going off the calendar a little bit, and we will be hosting a discussion right here, might even be in the Micro Cinema, I believe. October 27th is the Grand Rapids Feminist Film Fest. It's a free event. It's from 12 to 9. There's a variety of panels and films and workshops and all that good stuff, so please come to that. And we will have a panel that's going to be analyzing the show Pose. So I think that's going to be a really great discussion. We do these screen clubs here in the Micro as part of the Fountain Street Church Learning Commons every month. So we have not announced what show is going to be happening in November, but stay tuned. We will post that. It'll be on the Wealthy Theater Facebook page, event page.
Miami Vice.
And we'll see. And through Fountain Street Church. So thank you guys so much for coming. If you have any questions, we'll kind of hang out for a little bit, and hopefully we will see you next time.
You got to load up that scene. Never forget. Barb. Maybe Sarah will load up the scene that created so much rage and dissension.
For sure, that link on the Facebook page.
We'll do that. We'll do that.
Hey, that was fast.
Yeah, I
just watched that.
But it should be really good. So we're gonna show up.
Thank you. Thank you for
Yes,
coming.
thank you so
That
much.
was definitely like, what are they talking about?
Well, when you track down that scene and realize the leverage on it, you're gonna go, that idiot, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But, we love conversation. If you want to write to us at info@thrillerchiller.com, we meet up, do coffee or whatever. That'd be awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So you teed up this whole framework, this whole elaborate design. So what would be a really satisfying, like,
What would have been the satisfying
or
closing?
not yet in season 3, but
video.
I'm saying like in season 4 or 5, like character self-actualization.
So what?
We have to take all the items from the modernist film and then oil to what we want to see, and I'm all like.
So what I would do if I was writing it, season 4 takes place in 1999.
Oh wow.
Season 5 is in 2019.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
Trans Foundation.
So what would that allow you to do?
So that would allow me to be able to use the same elements of nostalgia that I used as leverage in 85, with this kind of perception. And now you have Mike as a Trump.